The glass-walled boardroom of Ashford Holdings glittered with the skyline of New York City, 40 floors above the street. Every seat at the long mahogany table was taken, shareholders, extended family, the kind of people who measured worth in net assets and last names. I walked in without hurrying, the click of my heels swallowed by the low hum of polite conversation. No one stood. No one greeted me. Margaret was already at the center of the room, flawless as ever in a slate blue suit, her smile warm enough for the cameras but cold enough for me to feel it from 20 feet away. She didn't wait for the lawyer to start. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, turning slightly so the room had the best view of her profile, "allow me to introduce my older sister, Alina Ashford, our guest of honor today. She left the family years ago for a principle no one could quite understand." A few people chuckled under their breath. The rest just glanced at me like I was a name on a balance sheet they'd already written off. I didn't rise to it. Not then. The lawyer cleared his throat, shuffling the stack of documents in front of him. "Shall we begin?" The doors at the far end of the boardroom swung open. A man in a dark, tailored uniform stepped inside, the faint glint of metals catching the morning light. General Marcus Reed. Even the most jaded faces in the room straightened at the sight of him. He didn't nod to the shareholders. He didn't even glance at Margaret. He walked the length of the table without breaking stride, stopping directly in front of me. "Special Agent Ashford," he said, voice low and precise. Then, before anyone could process, he raised his hand in a crisp military salute. The room froze. Margaret's confident posture faltered, her eyes darting between us. A senior board member shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Someone's glass clinked against the table. I returned his gaze, but not the salute. Old habits and old wounds kept me still. When he lowered his hand, the silence felt heavy enough to press against the glass walls. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, clearly aware that every eye in the room had shifted toward me, or rather, toward the man still standing at my shoulder. He cleared his throat again, slower this time. "To Margaret Ashford," he began, "your father leaves ownership of the Ashford Grand Hotel chain, along with an 18% share in the family trust." Margaret's smile returned, sharp and polished, like the edge of a blade. She leaned back in her chair, fingers drumming once against the armrest. "And to Alina Ashford," the lawyer paused, scanning the next page as if to make sure he had read it correctly. "Your father leaves the Aegis Vault, located beneath the East 47th Street property, along with full operational control, intellectual property rights, and unrestricted access to all encrypted archives contained within." Margaret blinked. "The what?" Several board members frowned. One man at the far end actually laughed under his breath. "It's just the old records basement," Margaret said, waving a hand like she was brushing away dust. General Reed's voice cut clean through the room. "It's not a basement." Heads turned. His tone didn't rise, but it didn't have to. "I toured it 2 years ago at your father's invitation," Reed continued. "What's down there is a fully secure financial intelligence hub, a live system capable of tracing, freezing, or shielding assets across borders in real time." The lawyer resumed reading, his voice steady. "The vault is currently linked to multiple ongoing operations with international agencies. Strategic direction, staffing, and all future contracts are at Alina Ashford's sole discretion." The air shifted again, but this time, it was the kind of shift you could feel in your bones. The lawyer reached for a smaller envelope, sealed in deep crimson wax. My father's name was written across the front in the kind of bold, deliberate handwriting that could cut through years. "This," the lawyer said, "is to be read aloud per Mr. Ashford's explicit instructions." Margaret sighed audibly, leaning back like she was settling in for a performance. My mother stared at the polished surface of the table as if she could disappear into it. The lawyer broke the seal, unfolded a single page, and began. Alina, if you're hearing this, it means I am gone, and it means they are all here to hear what I never said while I was alive. You were cast out not because you were weak, but because you refused to bend. You saw this family for what it had become, and you refused to clean its sins with your silence. I resented you for that, until I realized you were the only one still carrying our name with honor. Across the table, Margit's smirk tightened into a thin line. The Aegis Vault is yours because you understand that power without integrity is rot. I trust you will never sell it for status or comfort. You will use it to guard what others would destroy. That is why it was built in secret, for the one person in this bloodline who doesn't need applause to do the right thing. The lawyer's voice didn't waver. If anyone asks why you weren't there when I died, tell them I forbade anyone to tell you. I didn't want your last memory of me tainted by the people who would stand beside my bed and still think of themselves first. That was my choice, not yours. A sharp inhale came from somewhere near the end of the table. And to the rest of you, if you've confused performance with loyalty, I hope you learn the difference before it's too late. Alina does not need your permission to be who she is. None of us do. The lawyer lowered the page. The silence was absolute, the kind that doesn't just hang in the air, it crushes it. Margit's fingers, perfectly manicured, curled into her palm. My father's oldest friend stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. General Reed didn't move from my side. He didn't need to. 3 weeks after the reading, I stood in the elevator descending 35 feet below the East 47th Street property. The doors opened onto a corridor lined with reinforced steel and biometric locks. The Aegis Vault wasn't just a secure room. It was an entire underground nerve center. Rows of climate-controlled servers hummed behind glass panels. A map wall glowed with live financial movements across continents. In the center, a command table displayed encrypted feeds, flashing with updates I hadn't been cleared to see in over a decade. My father had hidden all this while letting the family believe it was a dusty archive. By the end of my first month, I had reactivated dormant contracts with 2 international agencies, hired back operatives my father had pushed out, and rerouted dormant capital into a whistleblower protection fund. Every decision was deliberate. Every step placed distance between me and the people upstairs who were still pretending the will had been some elaborate mistake. 6 months in, I had control over assets and information networks that could freeze a politician's offshore account before their morning coffee, and I made sure word of that traveled, not through press releases or photo ops, but through the kind of channels that reach the people who understand power in its rawest form. That was when Margit showed up. No entourage, no cameras, just a gray wool coat, dark circles under her eyes, and a tone I'd never heard from her before. "I need help," she said quietly. "There's a deal going bad, and if it collapses, people will get hurt, not just me." I held her gaze for a long moment. Then I keyed in the security code and stepped aside. Margit stepped into the vault like she was crossing into another country, one where her charm had no currency. She paused just inside the door, eyes flicking over the glowing map wall, the encrypted terminals, the silent figures moving between workstations. "This is what you've been doing?" she asked, her voice almost lost in the low hum of servers. "No," I said, walking past her toward the command table. "This is what I've been building." She followed, slower now, as if the weight of the place pressed on her shoulders. I pulled up a secure feed showing the tangled trail of her deal, shell companies, offshore accounts, and a list of names that didn't belong anywhere near her business. Her jaw tightened. "I didn't know it was this bad." "That's because you don't look until it's on fire," I said. "The question is, do you want me to put it out, or let it burn?" For a moment, I thought she'd snap back, reach for the familiar armor of sarcasm. Instead, she nodded once. "Help me." Over the next 3 weeks, Margaret was in the vault almost daily. She kept her head down, taking instructions from my analysts without protest. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I'd catch her watching the recruits in the training wing, young operatives learning to track corruption across borders, just like I once had. One afternoon, as she left, she stopped at the threshold. "I can't undo what I did," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "But maybe I can do something that matters." I didn't answer. In the vault, words were easy. Showing up was what counted. And for the first time in years, Margaret kept showing up. By the spring of 2050, the Aegis Vault was no longer a secret whispered about in boardrooms. It was a recognized global hub, a place where data, strategy, and grit converged to dismantle corruption before it could take root. I'd long stopped wondering if my parents would call. They didn't. And the silence didn't feel like exile anymore. It felt like space. Space to decide who earned a seat at my table. Margaret still came around. Not every week, but often enough. She worked with the younger recruits, teaching them how to command a room, how to speak without apology. I never asked if it was penance or purpose. Maybe she didn't know either. One night, after the vault had gone quiet, I walked the perimeter to the far end of the training floor. Through the glass wall, the city glowed in the distance, alive, restless, and oblivious to what was being protected below its streets. On my desk upstairs, my father's letter sat framed in black steel. "You don't need their permission to be who you are." I used to think those words were a wound. Now they were a key. When I finally locked the vault for the night, I looked back at its heavy steel door. Behind it wasn't just the inheritance they tried to keep from me. It was the life I built after they failed. And for the first time, I realized this story didn't need an ending. Some legacies aren't meant to close. They're meant to keep working in the quiet long after the applause fades.